Hey there, night wanderers and history lovers. Tonight we begin with something a little different. We're diving deep into the strange, exhausting, and surprisingly bizarre world of Roman military sleep habits. From midnight guard rotations to sleeping standing up in full armour, the ways these ancient warriors caught their rest will either fascinate you into deeper slumber or keep you awake, wondering how they survived at all. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world at all hours of the night. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together through the sleepy corridors of Roman military history. Picture this. You're a Roman legionnaire stationed on the Germanic frontier. It's 3 in the morning, the temperature has dropped below freezing, and you're standing completely still in full armour, holding a 6-foot spear, trying not to fall asleep. Because if you do, if you're caught dozing off during your watch, the punishment isn't detention or extra kitchen duty. It's death. Welcome to the Roman military sleep schedule, where getting proper rest wasn't just about comfort. It was about survival, discipline, and maintaining the greatest fighting force the ancient world had ever seen. But here's what's fascinating. The Romans didn't just randomly assign sleep schedules and hope for the best. They engineered their rest patterns with the same precision they used to build roads, aqueducts, and empires. Every hour of sleep was calculated, every guard rotation planned, every moment of rest earned through discipline that would make modern military training look like summer camp. The Roman legions conquered most of the known world, not just through superior tactics and equipment, but through something far more subtle and powerful. They understood that tired soldiers are dead soldiers, and dead soldiers don't build empires. So they created a system of sleep, rest, and vigilance so sophisticated that military historians still study it today. Not because it was comfortable, but because it worked. Tonight, we're going to explore the weird, wonderful, and sometimes horrifying ways Roman soldiers managed sleep in a world where relaxation could mean death, and proper rest could mean the difference between victory and annihilation. Let's start with something that would terrify any modern soldier. Roman legionnaires often slept in what they called the testudo formation, even when they weren't fighting. Picture dozens of soldiers lying down in perfect rectangular formations, shields locked together overhead, creating a human turtle shell of sleeping warriors. It wasn't comfortable, it was strategic. See, Roman military camps weren't cozy retreats where soldiers could sprawl out and dream peacefully. They were temporary fortresses, built fresh every single night as the legions marched across hostile territory. And in hostile territory, you never knew when an attack might come. Barbarian tribes didn't follow civilized rules of engagement. They attacked at dawn, at midnight, during storms, during the quiet moments when exhausted soldiers might finally drop their guard. So the Romans developed what military scholars call defensive sleeping. Soldiers would arrange themselves in tight formations even while resting, shields positioned to create instant protection, weapons within arm's reach, and always, with designated watchers who never closed their eyes. But the testudo sleep formation was just the beginning. Roman engineers, those brilliant minds who gave us concrete and central heating, also designed specialized sleeping equipment that sounds like something from a medieval torture chamber. Take the lorica hamata, a chainmail shirt that weighed nearly 30 pounds. Most soldiers never took it off. They slept in it, marched in it, ate in it, and fought in it for months at a time. Why? Because in the chaos of a night attack, there wasn't time to put on armour. By the time you heard the war cries and clash of weapons, you had perhaps 30 seconds before enemy warriors were inside your camp stabbing at anything that moved. Roman soldiers learned to sleep armoured because unarmoured sleep was often permanent sleep. And then there were the shoes. Roman military sandals, called caligae, were designed with metal studs on the bottom for grip during long marches. But here's the strange part. Soldiers often slept wearing them, not because they were comfortable, but because they needed to be ready to march at a moment's notice. A Roman legion could break camp and be marching in formation within 10 minutes of receiving orders. Try doing that while fumbling around in the dark, looking for your boots. But the most bizarre sleeping habit was something called the vigil rotation. Roman military camps operated on a system of night watches that divided darkness into 4 equal periods. During each period, different groups of soldiers would be responsible for guarding the camp perimeter while others rested. Sounds reasonable, right? Here's the catch. The guards didn't just stand at their posts, they walked, constantly. Roman sentries were required to patrol their sections of the camp perimeter in precise patterns, never stopping, never sitting, never leaning against anything. They walked the same routes over and over, hour after hour, until their watch ended and the next group took over. Why? Because the Romans discovered something that modern sleep researchers have confirmed. The moment you stop moving in the middle of the night, especially when you're tired, your body wants to shut down. Standing still leads to dozing off. Dozing off leads to death. But walking sentries created their own problems. How do you stay awake while walking the same 50-metre patrol route for 3 hours straight in complete darkness? Roman military manuals actually contain detailed instructions for night guards, including specific mental exercises designed to prevent the mind from wandering into sleep. Guards were taught to count their steps, recite multiplication tables, mentally review the names and histories of their fellow soldiers, and practice complex military formations in their heads. Anything to keep the brain actively engaged while the body performed the monotonous task of walking back and forth along a predetermined path. And if mental exercises weren't enough, the Romans had backup systems. Senior soldiers, called decurions, would make random inspections of guard posts throughout the night. These weren't friendly check-ins. If a decurion found a guard sleeping, sitting down, or even appearing drowsy, the punishment was immediate and severe. First offence might mean extra duties or reduced rations. Second offence could mean flogging in front of the entire legion. Third offence was often execution. But here's where Roman military psychology gets really interesting. They didn't just punish individual soldiers for sleep-related failures. They made sleep discipline a collective responsibility. If one guard in a unit fell asleep and the camp was attacked, the entire unit faced punishment. This created a system where soldiers weren't just responsible for their own rest patterns, but for monitoring and supporting their comrades' ability to stay alert. Soldiers developed what we might call sleep partnerships. Battle-tested veterans would pair with newer recruits, teaching them techniques for managing fatigue, staying alert during long watches, and most importantly, recognizing the early signs of dangerous drowsiness in themselves and others. These partnerships weren't official military policy. They evolved organically because Roman soldiers understood that survival depended on everyone staying sharp. A drowsy guard didn't just endanger himself, he endangered the entire legion, so experienced soldiers invested time and energy in helping newer troops develop what modern military experts call sleep discipline. Roman sleep discipline went far beyond just staying awake during guard duty. It included specific techniques for falling asleep quickly when rest time was available, methods for sleeping soundly despite uncomfortable conditions, and strategies for functioning effectively on limited sleep during extended campaigns. Consider the problem of sleeping in armour. 30 pounds of metal chainmail doesn't exactly conform to your body like a comfortable mattress. Roman soldiers developed techniques for positioning themselves to minimise pressure points, using their shields as backrests and arranging their equipment to provide support rather than discomfort. They learned to sleep on their sides in specific positions that prevented the chainmail from bunching up or creating painful pressure on joints. They used their woolen cloaks not just as blankets but as padding between their bodies and the hard metal of their armour. Some soldiers even developed the ability to sleep standing up, leaning against their spears or the walls of temporary fortifications. But perhaps the strangest aspect of Roman military sleep culture was their approach to dreams. Roman soldiers, like most people in the ancient world, believed that dreams carried important messages from the gods. But in a military context, dreams could be dangerous distractions or, worse, omens of defeat and death. Roman military training included instructions on how to interpret and respond to different types of dreams. Nightmares about defeat in battle were considered bad omens that needed to be reported to officers and addressed through ritual purification. Dreams about home and family were seen as signs of weakening discipline that could undermine a soldier's effectiveness. Most interesting were the shared dreams. Roman military records contain numerous accounts of entire units experiencing similar dreams on the same night. Modern psychologists might explain this as the result of shared stress, similar daily experiences, and the power of suggestion in close-knit groups. But to Roman soldiers, shared dreams were divine communications that required immediate attention from military priests and commanders. These shared dream experiences often influenced major military decisions. If multiple soldiers dreamed of victory before a planned battle, commanders took it as divine approval for their strategy. If soldiers reported dreams of defeat or death, battles were sometimes postponed while priests performed rituals to appease angry gods. The Romans also developed specific techniques for what they called military dreaming. Soldiers were taught to focus their minds on tactical problems or strategic questions before falling asleep, with the hope that their dreams might provide solutions or insights. While this might sound like ancient superstition, modern research has confirmed that the sleeping brain can indeed continue working on problems encountered during waking hours. Roman military engineers even designed camp layouts with sleep quality in mind. The standard Roman military camp, called a castra, followed a precise rectangular plan that wasn't just about defense and organization. It was about creating conditions that promoted effective rest for thousands of soldiers. The camp was oriented to take advantage of prevailing winds for ventilation and positioned to minimize noise from nearby rivers, forests, or other natural features that might disturb sleeping soldiers. The central area, where officers' tents were located, was deliberately placed to be the quietest section of the camp. Soldier tents were arranged in neat rows with specific spacing, designed to balance privacy with security. Too much space between tents created opportunities for enemy infiltration. Too little space meant that noise and movement from one tent would disturb neighbouring soldiers. Roman engineers calculated the optimal distance for promoting both rest and safety. Even the interior layout of individual tents reflected Roman obsession with sleep efficiency. Standard legionnaire tents housed 8 soldiers, arranged in a specific pattern that maximised space while ensuring that no soldier's movement would unnecessarily disturb his tent mates. Equipment was stored in designated areas to prevent the clanking of metal gear from waking sleeping soldiers. But the Romans went even further. They developed what modern military historians call micro-sleep techniques, methods for catching brief moments of rest during active campaigns without compromising alertness or readiness. These weren't full sleep cycles, but carefully timed periods of reduced consciousness that could provide crucial restoration during extended operations. Roman soldiers learned to sleep with one eye open, literally. Veterans developed the ability to maintain partial awareness of their surroundings while allowing their minds and bodies to rest. This skill was so valued that it was passed down through informal mentorship networks, with experienced legionnaires teaching younger soldiers how to achieve this state of controlled unconsciousness. The technique involved specific breathing patterns, muscle relaxation exercises, and mental focus methods that allowed soldiers to hover between wakefulness and sleep. They could rest their minds while keeping their ears tuned to the sounds of approaching danger. A sudden noise, an unusual movement, or a whispered warning would instantly bring them to full alertness. This partial sleep ability proved especially valuable during siege operations, which could last for months. Roman armies besieging enemy cities couldn't maintain full alertness 24 hours a day for weeks on end, but they also couldn't afford to be caught off guard by desperate defenders attempting nighttime breakouts or relief forces trying to lift the siege. So Roman soldiers developed shift patterns that went beyond simple guard rotations. They created overlapping layers of awareness, with some soldiers in deep sleep, others in partial rest states, and still others in full alert mode. At any given moment, the Roman camp maintained multiple levels of consciousness, creating a defensive network that never truly slept. The Romans also discovered what modern sleep researchers now know about sleep debt and recovery. They understood that soldiers could function on reduced sleep for limited periods, but that this deficit had to be repaid or performance would degrade catastrophically. Roman military campaigns included planned rest periods, usually timed to coincide with favourable weather or tactical pauses in fighting. During these recovery periods, Roman discipline actually relaxed slightly. Soldiers were allowed to sleep longer, guard rotations were reduced, and some of the more stringent alertness requirements were temporarily suspended. But even during rest periods, the Romans maintained their basic security protocols. They never completely dropped their guard. These planned recovery phases weren't just about physical rest. Roman commanders understood that extended stress and sleep deprivation affected soldiers' mental state, decision-making ability, and unit cohesion. Rest periods included recreational activities, religious ceremonies, and social interactions designed to restore not just physical energy, but psychological resilience. Roman military medicine also included treatments for sleep-related problems. Army doctors, called medici, developed remedies for insomnia, techniques for treating soldiers who suffered from persistent nightmares, and methods for helping traumatized veterans regain the ability to sleep peacefully. Some of these treatments sound surprisingly modern. Roman military doctors prescribed specific dietary changes to promote better sleep, recommended physical exercises to reduce pre-sleep anxiety, and used herbal preparations to treat various sleep disorders. They understood the connection between physical health, mental state, and sleep quality centuries before modern medicine rediscovered these relationships. But Roman military doctors also employed techniques that modern medicine would consider questionable at best. They used bloodletting to treat soldiers who suffered from what they called excess sleep, believing that too much rest made warriors soft and unreliable. They prescribed deliberately uncomfortable sleeping conditions for soldiers who seemed to be developing too much fondness for rest and comfort. The Romans believed that a soldier's relationship with sleep revealed important aspects of his character and military potential. Soldiers who could function effectively on minimal rest were considered natural leaders. Those who required more sleep were viewed with suspicion, seen as potentially unreliable during critical situations. This attitude created its own problems. Some Roman soldiers pushed themselves beyond reasonable limits, developing chronic sleep deprivation that impaired their judgment and effectiveness. Others learned to hide signs of fatigue, fearing that appearing tired would damage their military careers. Roman military records contain accounts of soldiers collapsing from exhaustion during battles, falling asleep while marching, and making critical errors due to fatigue-induced confusion. These incidents were typically blamed on individual weakness rather than systemic problems with military sleep policies. But the Romans also recognized that different types of military operations required different approaches to sleep management. Garrison duty in peaceful provinces allowed for more regular sleep schedules and comfortable accommodations. Active campaign conditions demanded the harsh discipline and constant alertness we've been discussing. Frontier duty presented unique challenges. Soldiers stationed along the empire's borders faced irregular threats that didn't follow predictable patterns. Barbarian raids could happen at any time, requiring constant vigilance but also sustainable rest practices that could be maintained for years rather than weeks. Roman frontier forts included specialized sleeping facilities designed for long-term occupation. These weren't temporary camp arrangements, but permanent barracks with features designed to promote both security and rest quality. Stone walls provided better insulation than canvas tents. Raised sleeping platforms kept soldiers off cold ground. Windows were positioned to provide ventilation while maintaining security. But even in permanent installations, Roman soldiers maintained their disciplined approach to sleep. Barracks life included strict lights-out times, designated quiet hours, and continued guard rotations. The comfort of permanent quarters didn't mean abandoning military sleep discipline. Roman military engineering even extended to designing facilities that could accommodate the sleep needs of different types of soldiers. Officers' quarters were positioned to be quieter and more private, reflecting their need for rest that would allow them to make complex decisions. Common soldiers' barracks were designed for efficiency and security, with multiple soldiers sharing rooms to maintain unit cohesion, even during rest periods. The Romans understood that sleep quality affected every aspect of military performance, from individual soldier effectiveness to unit coordination to strategic decision-making. They developed systems and practices that balanced the competing demands of security, discipline, efficiency, and human physiology. These systems weren't perfect, and they often prioritized military effectiveness over individual comfort or well-being, but they worked well enough to help Roman legions conquer and hold territory across 3 continents for centuries. The Roman approach to military sleep was just one component of a larger system that turned ordinary men into the most effective fighting force in the ancient world. And as we'll see, some of the strangest aspects of Roman military sleep culture had nothing to do with tactical necessity and everything to do with beliefs about honor, discipline, and the proper relationship between warriors and rest. Roman soldiers developed an almost mystical relationship with what they called the hora mortis, the hour of death, that period between 3 and 4 in the morning when the human body naturally reaches its lowest point of alertness. Modern sleep researchers have confirmed what Roman military commanders observed through brutal experience. More soldiers died during this single hour than any other time of night, not from enemy attacks, but from simple human error. Guards would step into holes they couldn't see in the darkness. Sentries would walk off cliffs while following patrol routes they'd memorized during daylight. Soldiers would accidentally stab their own comrades, mistaking friendly voices for enemy whispers in the pre-dawn gloom. The Romans called these deaths the price of vigilance, and they developed elaborate rituals and techniques specifically designed to survive this deadly hour. The most bizarre of these was the practice of controlled hallucination. Roman military manuals contain detailed descriptions of how exhausted guards should respond when they began seeing things that weren't there. Because here's the thing about extreme sleep deprivation. Your brain doesn't just get tired, it starts creating its own reality. Veteran Roman sentries learned to distinguish between different types of hallucinations. Visual phantoms, like seeing enemy warriors in shadows, were considered less dangerous than auditory hallucinations, like hearing attack orders that were never given. The most dangerous were tactical hallucinations, where exhausted soldiers would become convinced they were receiving legitimate military commands from officers who weren't there. Roman training included specific protocols for these situations. Guards experiencing hallucinations were taught to perform what they called reality anchoring, physical actions designed to reconnect their minds with their actual surroundings. This might involve counting the metal studs on their sandals, reciting their unit's battle honours, or performing complex weapon drills that required precise coordination. But the Romans took this even further. They developed buddy systems specifically designed around hallucination management. Paired guards were trained to monitor each other for signs of phantom experiences and to provide gentle reality checks without compromising alertness or discipline. A guard might whisper to his partner, "Did you see that movement by the supply wagons?" Not because he actually saw movement, but because he needed confirmation that his eyes were showing him accurate information. These partnerships evolved into something like ancient psychological support networks. Experienced soldiers learned to recognize the early warning signs of dangerous fatigue in their comrades. The telltale glassy stare, the slight tremor in weapon grip, the tendency to respond to sounds that others couldn't hear. They developed subtle intervention techniques, ways to help struggling soldiers regain focus without drawing the attention of officers who might interpret fatigue as weakness or insubordination. Roman military culture also created what modern psychologists would recognize as group sleep rituals. Before settling down for rest periods, Roman units would perform collective activities designed to synchronize their sleep cycles and promote group cohesion even during unconsciousness. These weren't religious ceremonies exactly, though they often included prayers to Mars, the god of war, and other military deities. Instead, they were practical exercises designed to help entire units transition from the hyper-alertness required for combat readiness to the controlled relaxation necessary for restorative sleep. Soldiers would perform synchronized breathing exercises, group meditation techniques, and collective recitation of unit mottos and battle honors. The goal was to create what Roman military theorists called unified rest, a state where an entire unit could sleep deeply while maintaining a collective awareness of potential threats. Individual soldiers might be unconscious, but the unit as a whole maintained a kind of distributed vigilance through shared sleep patterns and synchronized awakening responses. This concept extended to the physical arrangement of sleeping soldiers. Roman units didn't just lie down randomly within their assigned tent or barrack space. They arranged themselves in specific patterns that reflected military hierarchy, personal relationships, and tactical considerations. Senior soldiers slept in positions that allowed them to quickly assess and respond to threats. Newer recruits were placed where veterans could monitor and protect them during vulnerable sleep periods. But the most fascinating aspect of Roman group sleep culture was their approach to shared dreaming and sleep communication. Roman military records contain numerous accounts of soldiers who claimed to receive tactical information or strategic insights through dreams that were somehow connected to their sleeping comrades. Whether this was actual supernatural communication, psychological suggestion, or simply the result of soldiers sharing similar concerns and experiences, Roman commanders took these reports seriously. Military decisions were sometimes influenced by patterns of shared dreams reported by multiple soldiers in the same unit. The Romans even developed techniques for what they called directed dreaming, methods for focusing the sleeping mind on specific military problems or tactical challenges. Soldiers would be instructed to concentrate on particular questions or scenarios before falling asleep, with the hope that their dreams might provide useful insights or solutions. This practice was especially common among Roman military engineers and siege specialists, who faced complex technical challenges that required creative problem solving. Engineers would deliberately sleep near the siege works they were constructing, believing that proximity to the problem would influence their dreams and potentially provide innovative solutions. Roman military medicine included specialized treatments for what they called war dreams, the persistent nightmares and disturbing sleep experiences that affected soldiers who had seen extensive combat. Military doctors understood that these sleep disturbances could impair a soldier's effectiveness and developed both individual and group therapies designed to restore peaceful rest. Some of these treatments involved exposure therapy, where soldiers were gradually re-exposed to combat-related sounds and images during controlled waking states to reduce their psychological impact during sleep. Others involved what we might recognize as early forms of group counseling, where soldiers shared and discussed their troubling dreams with comrades who had experienced similar traumas. Roman military doctors also prescribed specific sleeping positions and breathing techniques designed to prevent or reduce nightmares. They believed that certain physical postures during sleep could influence dream content and emotional state. Soldiers suffering from persistent war dreams were taught to sleep on their backs with their weapons positioned in particular ways, based on the theory that maintaining physical connection to familiar military equipment would provide psychological comfort during vulnerable sleep states. The Romans also developed sophisticated understanding of how different types of food and drink affected sleep quality and military performance. Roman military rations weren't just designed to provide nutrition and energy. They were carefully planned to promote specific types of rest and alertness patterns appropriate for different military situations. Before battle, Roman soldiers were fed meals high in protein and fat, designed to provide sustained energy while avoiding the digestive heaviness that might interfere with sleep quality. During siege operations, rations included specific herbs and preparations believed to promote alertness during long guard watches while allowing for quick, restorative rest during off-duty periods. Roman military camps included designated food preparation areas where cooks, called cocones, prepared meals according to precise specifications designed to support the sleep schedules and alertness requirements of different military units. These weren't arbitrary traditions, but carefully developed nutritional strategies based on centuries of military experience. The Romans understood that alcohol could be both helpful and dangerous in military sleep management. Small amounts of wine could help exhausted soldiers relax and fall asleep quickly during brief rest periods, but too much alcohol impaired the quick awakening responses necessary for military effectiveness and could leave soldiers groggy and uncoordinated during critical moments. Roman military regulations included specific guidelines for alcohol consumption related to sleep and guard duty. Soldiers were allowed measured amounts of wine during designated rest periods, but consumption was strictly forbidden within a certain number of hours before guard duty or combat operations. Violations of these alcohol and sleep regulations were considered serious military offences. Roman military culture also created elaborate systems of sleep-based rewards and punishments that went far beyond the basic disciplinary measures for falling asleep on guard duty. Soldiers who demonstrated exceptional ability to function effectively on limited sleep were eligible for promotion and special assignments. Those who consistently struggled with sleep discipline faced not just punishment, but exclusion from elite units and prestigious postings. The Romans recognized that different individuals had different natural sleep requirements and abilities, but they also believed that proper military training could help any soldier develop adequate sleep discipline for military effectiveness. Roman training programs included specific exercises designed to gradually reduce sleep requirements and improve the ability to function on interrupted or insufficient rest. These training programs were progressive, starting with mild sleep deprivation during basic military instruction and gradually increasing the demands as soldiers advanced through their military careers. By the time a Roman soldier reached veteran status, he was expected to be able to function effectively on as little as 3 or 4 hours of sleep per night for extended periods. But the Romans also understood the dangers of pushing sleep deprivation too far. Military medical records contain accounts of soldiers who suffered what we would now recognize as severe sleep disorders, chronic insomnia, and psychological breakdowns related to extended sleep deprivation. Roman military doctors developed treatments for these conditions, though their methods were often harsh by modern standards. Roman military architecture reflected their sophisticated understanding of sleep requirements and challenges. Military hospitals, called Vala Tudinaria, included specialized wards for soldiers suffering from sleep-related disorders. These facilities were designed with features intended to promote healing rest, including sound-dampening materials, optimal window placement for natural light regulation, and layouts that minimized disturbances from medical activities. Even Roman military roads were designed with sleep considerations in mind. The famous Roman road system wasn't just about efficient troop movement. It included regularly spaced facilities where marching legions could rest safely and comfortably. These facilities, called mansiones, were positioned at distances that matched typical daily march schedules and included accommodations designed to provide optimal rest for soldiers who might need to resume marching at dawn. Roman military logistics included detailed planning for sleep equipment and facilities. Legions on campaign carried specialized gear designed to improve sleep quality under field conditions, including portable sleeping platforms, weather-resistant bedding, and even collapsible furniture designed to provide comfortable rest in temporary camps. The Romans developed different categories of military sleep based on tactical requirements and available resources. Garrison sleep in permanent fortifications allowed for regular schedules and comfortable accommodations. Campaign sleep during active military operations required portable equipment and flexible schedules. Emergency sleep during combat situations involved techniques for catching brief rest while maintaining readiness for immediate action. Each type of military sleep had its own protocols, equipment requirements, and training procedures. Roman soldiers were expected to master all three categories and to transition smoothly between them based on changing military circumstances. This flexibility in sleep management was considered as important as weapon skills or tactical knowledge in determining a soldier's military effectiveness. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Roman military sleep culture was how it balanced individual needs with collective requirements. Roman military leaders understood that sleep was both a personal biological necessity and a strategic military resource that had to be managed carefully to maintain unit effectiveness. They developed systems that allowed for individual variation in sleep requirements while maintaining the discipline and coordination necessary for military success. Veterans with proven track records were allowed more flexibility in their sleep schedules, while newer soldiers were held to strict standards designed to build discipline and test their suitability for military life. Roman military sleep culture created a unique social environment where rest became both a reward for good service and a test of military character. The ability to sleep soundly despite discomfort and danger was seen as evidence of courage and discipline. The willingness to sacrifice personal rest for unit security was considered a fundamental military virtue. These attitudes created complex psychological dynamics within Roman military units. Soldiers competed not just in displays of courage and skill, but in demonstrations of their ability to endure hardship and maintain effectiveness despite inadequate rest. Sleep became another arena for proving military worth and earning respect from comrades and superiors. The Romans understood that this competitive approach to sleep discipline could create problems, including soldiers who pushed themselves beyond safe limits and units that developed unrealistic expectations for human endurance. But they also recognized that military effectiveness required soldiers who could function in conditions that would incapacitate ordinary civilians. Their solution was to combine harsh discipline with practical support systems, creating military cultures that demanded exceptional performance while providing the training and resources necessary to achieve it. Roman military sleep practices were harsh by modern standards, but they were also remarkably sophisticated in their understanding of human psychology and physiology. The legacy of Roman military sleep culture extended far beyond the fall of the Western Empire. Medieval military organizations adopted many Roman practices, and traces of Roman sleep discipline can be found in military traditions that persist today. The fundamental insight that sleep is a strategic resource that must be managed carefully remains relevant to modern military planning and operations. The Romans also developed what they called sleep warfare, using their enemies' rest patterns as weapons against them. Roman military intelligence units, called speculatores, spent considerable time studying the sleep habits of opposing armies. They observed when enemy sentries changed shifts, identified periods of reduced vigilance, and mapped the sleeping arrangements within enemy camps. This intelligence wasn't just gathered for planning attacks. The Romans used sleep disruption as a psychological weapon. They would launch false alarms during the enemy's deepest sleep periods, not to attack, but simply to deny rest. Roman catapults would hurl stones into enemy camps at random intervals throughout the night, not targeting specific structures, but creating constant anxiety that prevented peaceful sleep. The goal was to create what Roman military theorists called sleep debt warfare. By consistently disrupting enemy rest for days or weeks, Roman forces could degrade their opponent's decision-making, ability, coordination, and morale without engaging in costly direct combat. Exhausted enemies made mistakes. Tired soldiers couldn't maintain formation discipline. Sleep-deprived commanders issued confused or contradictory orders. Roman generals like Julius Caesar wrote extensively about using sleep deprivation as a siege tactic. During the siege of Alesia, Caesar's forces maintained constant noise and activity around the Gallic fortifications, using drums, horns, and shouted commands to prevent the defenders from achieving restorative rest. The Romans could maintain this pressure because their own forces operated on carefully planned rest rotations that allowed them to sustain operations indefinitely. But the Romans also had to defend against similar tactics used by their enemies. Barbarian tribes often attacked Roman camps during the Hora Mortis, that deadly period between 3 and 4 in the morning when human alertness naturally reached its lowest point. Germanic warriors were particularly skilled at silent infiltration during these vulnerable hours. Roman defensive sleep strategies evolved in response to these threats. They developed what they called layered consciousness, a system where different sections of the camp maintained different levels of alertness throughout the night. The outer perimeter guards remained in full alert status. Interior guards operated in partial awareness mode. Sleeping soldiers were arranged in patterns that allowed for rapid awakening and deployment. This system created multiple defensive barriers that enemies had to penetrate sequentially. Even if infiltrators managed to bypass the outer sentries during their most vulnerable moment, they would still face interior guards who were specifically trained to detect subtle signs of intrusion. And beyond that, sleeping soldiers were positioned and equipped to transition instantly from unconsciousness to combat readiness. Roman military engineers designed camp layouts that supported these layered consciousness strategies. Tent arrangements created natural choke points that would force infiltrators into areas where partially alert guards could detect them. Equipment storage was positioned to create noise barriers that would amplify sounds of unauthorized movement. Even the placement of latrines and water sources was calculated to create opportunities for detecting enemy presence. The Romans also developed counter-infiltration techniques based on their understanding of sleep psychology. They learned to recognize the behavioral patterns of enemy scouts who were observing Roman camps to plan night attacks. Sleep-deprived infiltrators moved differently than well-rested ones. Exhausted scouts made subtle mistakes that trained Roman observers could identify. Roman counterintelligence units would sometimes allow enemy scouts to observe their camps while feeding them misleading information about Roman sleep patterns and defensive arrangements. They would stage fake guard rotations, create false patterns of activity, and manipulate the visual information available to watching enemies. This deception extended to individual soldier behavior. Roman troops were trained to maintain their normal sleep routines even when they suspected enemy observation, while secretly preparing for attacks that might come during seemingly vulnerable periods. The ability to appear normally asleep while remaining combat ready became a specialized skill that separated veteran legionnaires from inexperienced troops. Roman military medicine also developed treatments for what they called enemy-induced sleep disorders. Soldiers who had survived surprise attacks often developed persistent insomnia and anxiety that prevented normal rest. Military doctors understood that these conditions could spread through units, like contagions, creating widespread sleep problems that undermined military effectiveness. Treatment involved both individual therapy and group exercises designed to restore confidence in camp security and sleep safety. Soldiers suffering from attack-related insomnia were gradually re-exposed to normal sleep routines under carefully controlled conditions, with veteran comrades providing reassurance and protection during vulnerable rest periods. The Romans recognized that fear of sleep was sometimes more dangerous than actual sleep deprivation. Soldiers who became afraid to sleep properly would eventually collapse from exhaustion, making them liabilities to their units. Roman military culture had to balance legitimate security concerns with the practical need for soldiers to achieve restorative rest. Roman military training included specific exercises designed to help soldiers sleep effectively despite danger and uncertainty. These weren't just relaxation techniques, but practical skills for maintaining rest discipline under combat conditions. Soldiers learned to assess threat levels accurately, distinguishing between genuine dangers that required alertness and imaginary threats that interfered with necessary rest. This training involved graduated exposure to increasingly stressful sleep conditions. New recruits might begin by sleeping in secured barracks with minimal disturbances. As they progressed, they would practice sleeping in field conditions, then in simulated combat situations, and finally in actual frontier posts where enemy contact was possible. The goal was to develop what Roman military theorists called calibrated rest response, the ability to sleep as deeply as conditions safely allowed, while maintaining the capacity for instant awakening when genuine threats materialized. This skill required both physical conditioning and psychological training that could take years to master fully. Roman veterans developed an almost supernatural ability to distinguish between sounds that required attention and background noise that could be safely ignored during rest periods. They could sleep soundly through routine camp activities, weather disturbances, and even distant combat, while awakening instantly at the sound of their unit's specific alarm signals or unusual noises that might indicate infiltration. This selective hearing ability wasn't innate, but was developed through extensive practice and conditioning. Roman military training included exercises where soldiers practiced sleeping while exposed to various sounds and disturbances, learning to identify which auditory cues required awakening response and which could be safely ignored. The Romans also understood that different military roles required different sleep skills and schedules. Cavalry troops, who needed to maintain close relationships with their horses, often slept near their animals and developed sensitivity to equine behavior patterns that might indicate approaching danger. Infantry soldiers focused on human movement detection and small arms threats. Artillery crews, who operated siege engines and catapults, required different rest patterns because their equipment demanded extended setup and preparation times. They couldn't afford to be caught completely unprepared, but they also couldn't maintain constant readiness for weapons that took significant time to deploy effectively. Engineers and construction troops faced unique sleep challenges because their work often required them to sleep in partially completed fortifications or temporary shelters that offered minimal security. They developed specialized techniques for sleeping safely in construction zones while remaining alert to both military threats and workplace hazards. Medical personnel had perhaps the most complex sleep requirements because they needed to be available for emergency treatment at any time, while also maintaining the alertness necessary for complex medical procedures. Roman military hospitals operated on continuous schedules that required carefully coordinated rest rotations among medical staff. Roman military logistics included detailed planning for sleep-related supplies and equipment. Different types of military operations required different sleeping gear, from heavy winter equipment for northern campaigns to lightweight portable bedding for rapid deployment forces. The Romans developed standardized sleep equipment packages tailored to specific mission requirements. Supply officers, called quaestors, were responsible for ensuring that military units had appropriate sleeping accommodations and equipment for their assigned missions. This wasn't considered a minor logistical detail, but a critical component of military readiness that could affect the outcome of entire campaigns. Roman military procurement included contracts with specialized manufacturers who produced sleeping equipment designed specifically for military use. These weren't civilian products adapted for military purposes, but purpose-built items designed to meet the unique requirements of soldiers who needed to balance rest, readiness, and mobility. The quality and availability of sleep-related equipment became a factor in military morale and unit effectiveness. Well-supplied units with adequate sleeping facilities performed better than poorly equipped forces struggling with inadequate rest accommodations. Roman military leaders understood that investing in proper sleep equipment was as important as providing good weapons and armor. Roman military engineering included specialists who designed and constructed sleeping facilities for different types of military installations. Permanent fortress barracks required different features than temporary campaign shelters. Frontier outposts needed accommodations that could withstand siege conditions while still providing adequate rest for defenders. These military architects developed standardized designs that could be adapted to different geographic and tactical situations while maintaining consistent standards for sleep quality and security. Roman military construction manuals included detailed specifications for sleeping facilities, from individual soldier accommodations to large-scale barracks complexes. The Romans also developed protocols for adapting civilian buildings for military sleeping purposes when armies needed to occupy towns or cities. These conversion procedures ensured that requisitioned civilian accommodations could provide appropriate security and rest conditions for military personnel while minimizing disruption to local populations. Roman military occupation forces faced unique sleep challenges because they needed to maintain security in potentially hostile urban environments while avoiding actions that might provoke civilian resistance. They developed techniques for sleeping safely in occupied territories while maintaining the visibility and accessibility necessary for effective governance. These urban sleep strategies involved careful selection of billeting locations, establishment of secure communication networks between scattered sleeping sites, and development of rapid response protocols for dealing with threats to sleeping soldiers in civilian areas. Roman occupation forces learned to balance military security requirements with political considerations related to local population management. Roman military culture created elaborate social hierarchies around sleep privileges and responsibilities. Senior officers enjoyed private quarters and flexible sleep schedules, but they also bore greater responsibility for unit security and effectiveness during rest periods. Junior soldiers had less comfortable accommodations, but fewer decision-making burdens that might interfere with restorative sleep. These hierarchies weren't just about comfort and privilege. They reflected practical considerations related to the different sleep requirements of various military roles. Commanders needed private space for planning and decision-making that might occur at any hour. Common soldiers needed group accommodations that promoted unit cohesion and mutual support. Roman military promotion systems included evaluation of candidates' ability to manage sleep-related responsibilities effectively. Officers were expected to demonstrate skills in planning rest schedules, managing guard rotations, and maintaining unit alertness under various conditions. Poor performance in sleep management could prevent advancement to higher command positions. The Romans understood that leadership effectiveness was closely connected to sleep management skills. Commanders who couldn't maintain their own rest discipline or effectively manage their unit's sleep requirements were likely to fail in other aspects of military leadership. Sleep competence was considered a fundamental qualification for military command. Roman military retirement and veteran support systems included provisions for former soldiers who suffered from chronic sleep disorders related to their military service. Veterans who had developed insomnia, nightmares, or other rest-related problems received medical treatment and, in some cases, financial support to help them transition to civilian life. These veteran support programs reflected Roman understanding that military sleep discipline, while necessary for military effectiveness, could create lasting health problems that required ongoing treatment and management. The Romans recognized their responsibility to care for soldiers whose sleep health had been damaged by military service. Roman military records include detailed accounts of how sleep-related problems affected veteran reintegration into civilian society. Former soldiers often struggled to adapt to civilian sleep patterns after years of military rest discipline. Some veterans continued to sleep in armour or maintain elaborate security routines long after leaving military service. Roman military medicine developed specialised treatments for helping veterans transition from military to civilian sleep patterns. These programs included gradual reduction of security measures, training in civilian rest routines, and counselling to address anxiety and hypervigilance that interfered with peaceful sleep. The Romans also studied how different climates and geographic conditions affected military sleep requirements and effectiveness. Troops serving in hot desert regions needed different rest strategies than those stationed in cold northern forests. High-altitude assignments created unique challenges related to sleep quality and physical performance. Roman military medical corps included specialists who studied environmental effects on sleep and developed adaptation strategies for troops deploying to different geographic regions. These environmental sleep specialists created guidelines for helping soldiers adjust their rest patterns to local conditions while maintaining military effectiveness. Roman military training programs included preparation for sleep challenges associated with different deployment environments. Soldiers learned techniques for sleeping effectively in extreme temperatures, high altitudes, humid climates, and other challenging conditions they might encounter during their military careers. This environmental sleep training wasn't theoretical, but involved practical exercises in simulated conditions that replicated the challenges soldiers would face in different theatres of operation. Roman military bases included specialised training facilities designed to expose troops to various environmental sleep stressors under controlled conditions. The Romans understood that failure to prepare soldiers for environmental sleep challenges could result in widespread health problems and reduced military effectiveness when units deployed to unfamiliar climates. Environmental sleep adaptation became a standard component of Roman military training that was considered as important as weapon skills or tactical knowledge. Roman military forces also faced the challenge of what they called seasonal sleep adaptation. Winter campaigns in Germania required completely different rest strategies than summer operations in Egypt or North Africa. The Romans discovered that soldiers who thrived in one climate might struggle dramatically when deployed to regions with different seasonal patterns and daylight cycles. During winter campaigns, Roman soldiers dealt with darkness that lasted up to 16 hours per day in northern territories. This extended darkness disrupted natural sleep rhythms and created psychological challenges that Roman military doctors called winter melancholy. Soldiers would become lethargic during the day and restless during the brief periods of sunlight, leading to confused sleep schedules that undermined military effectiveness. Roman winter sleep protocols included specific techniques for managing these disrupted rhythms. Soldiers were required to maintain artificial daylight schedules using oil lamps and torches, even when natural light was minimal. They performed coordinated activities during designated daytime hours, regardless of actual sunlight availability, to preserve normal circadian patterns. But winter sleep management went beyond just maintaining schedules. Roman engineers developed specialized heating systems for military barracks that provided warmth without creating fire hazards or consuming excessive fuel supplies. These heating systems, called hypercores, circulated warm air through hollow walls and floors, maintaining comfortable sleeping temperatures even in harsh winter conditions. Roman soldiers learned to sleep in layers of clothing and bedding that could be quickly adjusted based on changing temperatures throughout the night. They developed techniques for sharing body heat while maintaining individual sleeping spaces, creating warmth pools within barracks that helped everyone sleep more comfortably during extreme cold. Summer campaigns presented opposite challenges. In desert regions, daytime temperatures could reach levels that made normal activity impossible, forcing Roman forces to adopt nocturnal operation schedules. Soldiers would sleep during the hottest daylight hours and conduct military activities during cooler evening and early morning periods. This reversed schedule created its own problems. Sleeping during bright daylight required specialized equipment and techniques that most soldiers had never encountered during their training. Roman desert forces developed portable shade structures, underground sleeping chambers, and even early versions of what we might recognize as sleeping masks to block out daylight during rest periods. Roman military medical corps documented how heat affected sleep quality and military performance. They discovered that soldiers sleeping in temperatures above certain thresholds experienced reduced decision-making ability, slower reaction times, and increased irritability that could lead to discipline problems and unit conflicts. Desert sleep management became a specialized skill that required extensive training and experience to master effectively. Roman forces operating in hot climates developed elaborate cooling techniques, including dampened clothing systems, underground rest chambers, and carefully timed water consumption patterns designed to promote better sleep quality. The Romans also learned to use seasonal sleep challenges as tactical advantages against enemies who lacked similar adaptation training. Roman forces could maintain effectiveness in extreme climates where opposing armies struggled with sleep deprivation and environmental stress. Roman military intelligence units studied enemy sleep patterns and environmental adaptations, looking for weaknesses that could be exploited during campaigns in challenging climates. They would time attacks to coincide with periods when enemy forces were most likely to be struggling with climate-related sleep problems. But perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of Roman military sleep culture was their understanding of what they called campaign sleep evolution. Roman military theorists recognized that soldiers' sleep requirements and abilities changed over the course of extended military operations, and they developed strategies for managing these changes effectively. During the initial weeks of a campaign, soldiers typically experienced heightened alertness and reduced sleep requirements due to excitement and adrenaline. Roman commanders learned to take advantage of this natural hyper-alertness for rapid movement and aggressive operations that might be impossible later in the campaign. As campaigns progressed and the initial excitement wore off, soldiers entered what Roman military doctors called the fatigue plateau, a period where sleep requirements increased but quality often decreased due to accumulated stress and environmental challenges. This phase required careful management to prevent widespread exhaustion that could cripple military effectiveness. Roman campaign planning included specific provisions for managing fatigue plateau periods. Operations were scaled back during these phases, with emphasis placed on rest and recovery rather than aggressive action. Roman commanders learned to recognize the signs of approaching fatigue plateaus and adjust their strategic plans accordingly. Long-term campaigns that lasted months or years presented additional challenges as soldiers adapted to prolonged separation from normal civilian life and sleep patterns. Roman military culture developed rituals and traditions designed to help soldiers maintain psychological health during extended deployments, while preserving military effectiveness. These extended campaign sleep strategies included regular communication with home communities, scheduled recreational activities, and religious observances that provided psychological anchors to civilian life. Roman commanders understood that soldiers who lost connection to their pre-military identities were more likely to develop sleep disorders and other problems that affected unit cohesion. Roman military rotation policies were designed partly around sleep and fatigue management considerations. Units serving in particularly challenging environments were rotated back to easier assignments before accumulated sleep debt, and environmental stress could cause permanent health problems or discipline breakdowns. The Romans also developed early warning systems for identifying units that were approaching dangerous levels of sleep deprivation or fatigue-related stress. These systems allowed commanders to intervene with rest periods, medical treatment, or reassignment before problems became severe enough to affect military operations. Roman military medical records include detailed studies of how different types of combat exposure affected soldiers' sleep patterns and psychological health. They documented that soldiers who experienced intense combat developed different sleep disorders than those who served in garrison duties or support roles. Combat-related sleep problems included persistent nightmares, hypervigilance that prevented relaxation, and startle responses that caused soldiers to wake at the slightest sound or movement. Roman military doctors developed specialized treatments for these conditions, though their methods were often harsh by modern standards. Treatment for combat sleep disorders often involved controlled re-exposure to combat situations under medical supervision, based on the theory that avoiding combat-related triggers would prevent soldiers from recovering their ability to sleep normally. Roman military hospitals included facilities designed to provide controlled combat simulation for therapeutic purposes. Roman military culture also recognized that different personality types adapted differently to military sleep requirements. Some soldiers naturally adapted to irregular schedules and high-stress conditions, while others struggled throughout their military careers with sleep-related challenges. Roman military selection and assignment processes included informal evaluation of candidates' sleep adaptation abilities. Soldiers who demonstrated natural ability to function on limited rest were often assigned to elite units or special operations that required exceptional sleep discipline. Conversely, soldiers who consistently struggled with sleep requirements were often assigned to support roles or garrison duties where regular schedules and comfortable accommodations were more readily available. This wasn't considered punishment, but practical assignment based on individual capabilities and limitations. Roman military training programs included exercises specifically designed to identify soldiers with exceptional sleep discipline capabilities. These exercises involved progressively challenging sleep deprivation scenarios that tested not just physical endurance, but psychological resilience and decision-making ability under extreme fatigue. Soldiers who excelled in these sleep discipline tests were often recruited for specialized units that operated in particularly challenging conditions. These elite forces required soldiers who could maintain effectiveness during extended operations with minimal rest opportunities. Roman military promotion systems included consideration of sleep discipline, performance as a factor in advancement decisions. Officers were expected to demonstrate superior ability to function effectively despite inadequate rest, and to help their subordinates develop similar capabilities. The Romans understood that leadership under fatigue was one of the most challenging aspects of military command. Officers who couldn't maintain decision-making ability when exhausted were likely to fail during critical moments when rest wasn't available. Roman military command training included specific exercises designed to test leadership ability under sleep deprivation conditions. Prospective officers were required to make complex tactical decisions manage personnel issues, and coordinate military operations while experiencing various levels of fatigue and sleep debt. These leadership sleep tests weren't just individual challenges, but involved managing entire units under sleep deprivation conditions. Candidates had to demonstrate ability to maintain unit cohesion, effectiveness, and morale while everyone was operating under significant fatigue stress. Roman military culture created complex social dynamics around sleep that went far beyond simple rest requirements. Sleep became a marker of military status, personal discipline, and unit identity that influenced how soldiers related to each other and their military roles. Veterans who had demonstrated exceptional sleep discipline during combat operations gained respect and influence that extended into all aspects of military life. Their advice on sleep management was sought by younger soldiers, and their techniques were passed down through informal mentorship networks. Roman military units developed distinctive sleep cultures that reflected their operational roles and geographic assignments. Desert forces developed different traditions than northern garrison troops. Elite units created sleep rituals that reinforced their special status and unit cohesion. These unit-specific sleep cultures included specialized equipment, unique rest schedules, and distinctive approaches to managing fatigue and alertness that became part of unit identity. Soldiers took pride in their unit's particular sleep traditions and capabilities, seeing them as evidence of superior military effectiveness. Roman military ceremonies and celebrations included recognition of sleep-related achievements and milestones. Soldiers who completed challenging assignments without compromising rest discipline received formal acknowledgement, and units that maintained effectiveness despite extreme fatigue conditions were honoured with special designations. The Romans understood that recognizing sleep discipline achievements was important for maintaining morale and encouraging continued adherence to demanding rest standards. Sleep recognition ceremonies became regular features of Roman military life that reinforced the importance of rest management in military success. Roman military retirement ceremonies included reflection on sleep-related service and sacrifice. Veterans were honoured not just for their combat achievements, but for their years of maintaining alertness and rest discipline under challenging conditions. These retirement recognitions acknowledged that military sleep discipline took a long-term toll on soldiers' health and well-being, and that veteran sleep problems were legitimate consequences of military service that deserved respect and support. Roman military historical records include detailed accounts of how sleep-related factors influenced major battles and campaigns. Commanders who failed to manage their forces' rest requirements often suffered defeats that might have been avoided with better sleep discipline. Conversely, Roman victories were sometimes attributed partly to superior rest management that allowed Roman forces to maintain effectiveness when their enemies were weakened by fatigue and sleep deprivation. Sleep discipline became recognized as a legitimate tactical advantage that could determine campaign outcomes. Roman military education included study of historical examples where sleep factors had influenced battle results. Officer candidates learned to analyze these cases and apply lessons about rest management to their own tactical and strategic planning. The Romans documented specific techniques that had proven effective for managing sleep during different types of military operations. These documented methods became part of Roman military doctrine that was taught to successive generations of soldiers and officers. Roman military innovation included development of new equipment, techniques, and procedures designed to improve sleep management capabilities. Roman engineers and military doctors continuously worked to refine sleep-related tools and methods based on operational experience and changing tactical requirements. These innovations weren't just technical improvements, but represented systematic efforts to gain military advantages through superior rest management. The Romans understood that nations with better sleep discipline would ultimately prevail over those that neglected this aspect of military preparation. Roman military legacy includes sleep management principles that influenced military organizations for centuries after the fall of the Western Empire. Byzantine, medieval, and even modern military forces adopted techniques and concepts that originated with Roman sleep discipline innovations. The fundamental insight that sleep is a strategic resource requiring careful management remains relevant to contemporary military planning and operations. Modern military sleep research continues to build on foundations established by Roman military theorists and practitioners. Roman military sleep culture represents one of the most sophisticated and systematic approaches to rest management in military history. Their methods were harsh by contemporary standards, but they reflected deep understanding of human physiology, psychology, and the practical requirements of military effectiveness. The Romans proved that superior sleep discipline could provide decisive advantages in military competition, and that systematic attention to rest management was as important as weapons, tactics, or logistics in determining the outcome of armed conflicts. Their legacy reminds us that even the most basic human needs, like sleep, become complex strategic challenges in military contexts that require careful planning, specialized training, and continuous innovation to manage effectively. And as Roman soldiers discovered through centuries of trial and error, the line between rest and readiness, between vulnerability and vigilance, was often measured in heartbeats and determined by the quality of their dreams. But the most haunting aspect of Roman military sleep wasn't the discipline or the formations, or even the constant threat of death for dozing off. It was something the Romans called somnus mortis, the sleep of the dying. This wasn't a poetic metaphor. It was a documented medical phenomenon that Roman military doctors observed repeatedly across different legions and campaigns. When Roman soldiers reached the absolute limits of sleep deprivation, something strange happened. They didn't just collapse from exhaustion like you might expect. Instead, they entered a twilight state that looked like sleep, but wasn't restful at all. Their bodies would shut down partially, while their minds remained trapped in a kind of waking nightmare. Soldiers in somnus mortis would lie motionless with their eyes closed, appearing to sleep peacefully. But if you watched closely, you'd notice their hands still gripped their weapons. Their breathing remained shallow and rapid, like someone preparing for combat. And most disturbing of all, they would respond to military commands, even while seemingly unconscious. A centurion could whisper formation orders to a soldier in this state, and the man would stand up, march to position, and assume combat stance, all while his eyes remained closed and his face showed no expression. It was as if the military training had become so deeply embedded that it continued functioning even when conscious thought had shut down. Roman military doctors documented cases where entire units entered somnus mortis simultaneously after weeks of extreme sleep deprivation during prolonged sieges. These soldiers would perform their duties mechanically, following routine orders and maintaining basic military functions, but they showed no recognition of their comrades, no response to pain, and no memory of events that occurred during these episodes. The condition was particularly common among siege engineers who worked around the clock maintaining catapults and trebuchets during extended bombardments. The constant noise, the pressure to keep the machines operational, and the irregular sleep schedules would push these specialists into a kind of walking unconsciousness where they continued working despite being essentially asleep on their feet. But somnus mortis wasn't just a curiosity for Roman medical observers, it was a tactical nightmare. Soldiers in this condition were unreliable in combat because, while they could follow simple commands, they couldn't adapt to changing situations or make independent decisions. They were like military automatons, effective for routine tasks but dangerous liabilities when quick thinking was required. Roman commanders learned to recognize the early signs of approaching somnus mortis in their troops. Soldiers would begin responding to questions with single-word answers. Their facial expressions would become fixed and mask-like. They would continue performing their duties, but with mechanical precision that lacked the fluid adaptability of conscious soldiers. When commanders identified soldiers entering this state, they faced a terrible choice. These men were still functional for basic military tasks, and removing them from duty meant reducing the unit's effective strength during critical operations. But keeping them in position risked catastrophic failures if complex decisions or rapid adaptations became necessary. The Romans developed what they called controlled somnus protocols for managing soldiers who had reached this extreme state of sleep deprivation. Rather than forcing these men to continue normal duties, commanders would assign them to simple, repetitive tasks that didn't require conscious decision-making but still contributed to military operations. Soldiers in controlled somnus might be assigned to maintain steady drum beats for marching cadence, operate simple machinery with repetitive motions, or perform guard duties in areas where threats were minimal and responses could be purely mechanical. These assignments allowed the men to remain useful while protecting them from situations where their impaired consciousness might prove deadly. Recovery from somnus mortis required what Roman military doctors called graduated awakening, a careful process of slowly reintroducing normal consciousness without shocking the system. Soldiers couldn't simply be shaken awake from this state because the sudden transition often resulted in complete psychological breakdown. Instead, Roman medical procedures involved gradual increases in environmental stimulation over several days. Soldiers would be moved to progressively brighter locations, exposed to increasing levels of sound and activity, and slowly reintroduced to normal human interaction until their consciousness fully returned. But even after recovery, soldiers who had experienced somnus mortis were never quite the same. Roman military records describe these veterans as having a distant quality, as if part of their minds remained trapped in that twilight state between wakefulness and sleep. Many developed chronic insomnia, seemingly afraid that sleep might trap them again in that mechanical unconsciousness. The phenomenon was so disturbing that Roman military culture developed superstitions around it. Some soldiers believed that somnus mortis was a punishment from the gods for insufficient devotion to duty. Others thought it was a blessing that allowed warriors to continue fighting even after their mortal bodies had reached their limits. Roman military priests developed rituals designed to protect soldiers from somnus mortis, including specific prayers to be recited before sleep and protective amulets worn during extended operations. Whether these spiritual interventions had any practical effect is unclear, but they provided psychological comfort to soldiers facing extreme sleep deprivation. The Romans also discovered that different types of military stress produced different variations of this extreme sleep state. Combat stress created a version of somnus mortis characterized by hypervigilance and violent reflexes. Administrative stress from prolonged siege management produced a more passive form focused on repetitive task performance. Environmental stress from extreme weather or difficult terrain created yet another variation, where soldiers would continue marching or working but lose all awareness of their surroundings beyond immediate task requirements. These men would walk for miles in formation but have no memory of the journey or recognition of landmarks they passed. Roman military training began incorporating exercises designed to build resistance to somnus mortis, though these methods were controversial even by Roman standards. Soldiers were subjected to progressively severe sleep deprivation while being required to perform increasingly complex tasks, building tolerance for functioning under extreme fatigue. These resistance training programs were dangerous and sometimes resulted in permanent psychological damage to participants. But Roman military leaders considered the risk acceptable because soldiers who could resist somnus mortis were invaluable during extended campaigns where normal sleep schedules became impossible. The Romans even weaponized their understanding of somnus mortis, using sleep deprivation tactics specifically designed to induce this condition in enemy forces. They would maintain constant low-level harassment of besieged cities, not to break defences immediately, but to gradually push defenders into states of walking unconsciousness. Enemy soldiers in Somnus Mortis became predictable and mechanical, following routine defensive patterns without adapting to changing Roman tactics. Roman forces could exploit this mechanical behaviour, timing attacks to coincide with the automatic responses of sleep-deprived defenders. But the most chilling aspect of Roman Somnus Mortis research was their documentation of what they called inherited sleep damage. Children born to veterans who had experienced extreme sleep deprivation often showed similar patterns of disturbed rest and mechanical behaviour, suggesting that the psychological trauma was somehow passed to the next generation. Roman military medical records include case studies of soldier families where sleep disorders appeared to run in bloodlines, creating dynasties of insomniacs and troubled sleepers. These families often produced excellent soldiers because they were naturally adapted to functioning with minimal rest, but they also suffered from higher rates of what we might now recognise as anxiety and depression. The legacy of Roman military sleep culture extended into civilian life in ways that shaped the broader society. Veterans returning to civilian occupations brought their disciplined approach to rest management, influencing everything from agricultural work schedules to urban guard rotations. Roman cities adopted modified versions of military watch systems for civilian security, with night patrols and guard rotations based on principles developed for military camps. These civilian adaptations helped maintain order and security, but also spread military sleep discipline throughout the general population. Roman industrial operations, including mining, construction, and manufacturing, incorporated military-inspired shift patterns and fatigue management techniques. The Romans understood that civilian productivity could be optimized using lessons learned from military sleep research. But civilian adaptation of military sleep culture also created social problems. Roman society developed expectations for sleep discipline that were unrealistic for ordinary citizens who lacked military training and conditioning. Workers who couldn't maintain military-style rest schedules were sometimes viewed as lazy or undisciplined. Roman family structures were influenced by military sleep patterns, with households adopting guard rotations for security, strict bedtime schedules for children, and disciplinary approaches to rest that reflected military values. These practices created family environments that prepared children for potential military service, but also imposed harsh standards on domestic life. Roman religious practices incorporated elements of military sleep culture, including vigils, night prayers, and spiritual exercises performed during traditional sleep hours. Religious communities adopted modified military rest schedules that balanced spiritual devotion with practical sleep requirements. The Romans even applied military sleep principles to their understanding of death and afterlife beliefs. Roman funeral rites included elements designed to ensure peaceful, eternal rest for the deceased, drawing parallels between military sleep discipline and spiritual preparation for death. Roman philosophical schools studied military sleep culture as a model for self-discipline and mental training. Stoic philosophers, in particular, incorporated military rest techniques into their practices for developing psychological resilience and emotional control. But perhaps the most lasting impact of Roman military sleep culture was its influence on subsequent military organizations throughout European history. Medieval armies, Renaissance condottieri, and even early modern professional forces adopted Roman techniques and principles for managing rest under military conditions. The fundamental insight that sleep is a strategic military resource requiring systematic management became embedded in Western military thinking and continues to influence contemporary military doctrine and training. Modern military sleep research builds directly on foundations established by Roman military theorists and practitioners. Roman innovations in sleep equipment, facility design, and fatigue management techniques provided templates that military engineers and medical personnel refined and adapted for changing technological and tactical requirements. The basic principles remained constant even as specific applications evolved. Today's military sleep laboratories, fatigue management protocols, and shift rotation systems all trace their conceptual origins to Roman military sleep culture. The Romans proved that systematic attention to rest requirements could provide decisive advantages in military competition, a lesson that remains relevant in contemporary strategic planning. But the Roman approach to military sleep also demonstrated the human costs of prioritizing military effectiveness over individual well-being. The psychological and physical toll of extreme sleep discipline created lasting damage that affected soldiers and their families for generations. Roman military sleep culture represents both the achievements and limitations of systematic approaches to human performance optimization. Their methods were remarkably effective for military purposes, but came at personal costs that modern military organizations are still learning to balance. The Romans showed that human sleep requirements are more flexible than most people realize, but also that pushing those limits too far creates consequences that extend far beyond individual soldiers or single military campaigns. Their legacy reminds us that even the most basic human needs become complex strategic challenges in military contexts. And somewhere in the archaeological record, buried beneath centuries of soil and time, lie the bones of Roman soldiers who spent their lives walking the fine line between rest and readiness, between human limitation and military necessity, leaving behind a legacy written in the language of disciplined exhaustion and dreams that never quite provided peace. Roman military sleep culture ultimately reveals something profound about human adaptability and the price of empire. These soldiers didn't just conquer territory through superior weapons or tactics. They conquered their own biological limitations, transforming sleep itself from a vulnerable necessity into a tool of military dominance. But transformation came with sacrifice. Every Roman soldier who learned to sleep standing up, who mastered the art of partial consciousness, who survived the mechanical nightmare of somnus mortis, paid a price measured in dreams never fully experienced and rest never completely achieved. Their sleep habits weren't just military procedures. They were adaptations that allowed ordinary humans to sustain extraordinary levels of performance under conditions that would break most people. The Romans proved that the boundaries of human endurance could be pushed far beyond what seems possible, but they also demonstrated that every boundary crossed leaves permanent marks on those who dare to cross it. And in the end, perhaps that's the most important lesson from Roman military sleep culture. Not the specific techniques or procedures, but the understanding that human potential is far more flexible than we imagine, and that the true cost of pushing those limits isn't always visible until generations later, when the children of veterans inherit dreams shaped by disciplines they never chose and rest patterns that echo with the footsteps of centuries who walked their posts 2,000 years ago. The Romans built an empire that lasted 1,000 years, but they also built something else, a legacy of human beings who learned to function beyond normal limits, who paid the price in sleep, never fully peaceful, and dreams that carried the weight of military discipline even in unconsciousness. Their rest habits weren't just about staying awake during guard duty. They were about transforming sleep itself into another battlefield where human will confronted human limitation, and somehow, impossibly, often won. Tonight, as you drift off to comfortable sleep in your warm bed, far from the frozen Germanic frontier or the scorching African desert, remember the Roman soldiers who learned to rest with one eye always open, one hand always on their weapon, and one part of their mind always listening for the sound of approaching footsteps in the dark. They conquered the world partly because they conquered sleep itself, and that victory, like all Roman victories, came at a cost that echoes still in the quiet hours before dawn, when the night is deepest and the boundary between dreams and vigilance grows thin. The Roman approach to sleep wasn't just about individual discipline. It was about creating what they called collective consciousness, a network of awareness that functioned even when individual soldiers were unconscious. This concept went far beyond simple guard rotations or buddy systems. The Romans discovered that groups of people sleeping in close proximity could somehow maintain a shared vigilance that protected everyone, even during deep sleep. Roman military theorists documented cases where entire tent groups would wake simultaneously at the approach of danger, even when no audible alarm had been given. Soldiers sleeping in formation would shift and move in coordinated patterns during the night, unconsciously adjusting their positions to maintain optimal defensive arrangements without any conscious coordination. This phenomenon was so reliable that Roman commanders began designing battle strategies around it. They would position sleeping soldiers in specific geometric patterns that maximized this collective awareness effect. Veteran units developed the ability to maintain tactical formations even while unconscious, with sleeping soldiers automatically adjusting their positions to fill gaps left by comrades who got up for guard duty or other nighttime activities. But collective consciousness came with its own dangers. Sometimes the shared awareness would misinterpret threats, causing entire units to wake in combat readiness for dangers that didn't exist. Roman military records describe incidents where hundreds of soldiers would simultaneously leap to their feet, weapons drawn. In response were particularly dangerous because they disrupted rest in reality. These false alarm episodes to shared dream experiences that had no basis patterns for entire units simultaneously, creating widespread fatigue that could persist for days. Roman commanders learned to distinguish between legitimate collective warnings and phantom threats, but the distinction wasn't always clear until after soldiers had lost critical sleep responding to imaginary dangers. The Romans also discovered that collective consciousness could be deliberately manipulated through what they called sleep suggestion techniques. Experienced centurions would whisper specific commands or information to sleeping soldiers, knowing that the messages would somehow spread through the unconscious network and influence the dreams and behavior of entire units. These sleep suggestion methods were used for everything from implanting tactical information to boosting morale during difficult campaigns. Roman military leaders would plant positive messages about upcoming battles, suggestions about enemy weaknesses, or reminders of unit honor and tradition in the collective unconscious of sleeping soldiers. But sleep suggestion could also backfire spectacularly. Negative thoughts or fears expressed by commanders could spread through sleeping units, like psychological contagions, creating unit-wide anxiety, depression, or defeatist attitudes that undermined military effectiveness. Roman military training included strict protocols about what could and couldn't be discussed near sleeping soldiers. Roman military culture developed elaborate rituals around what they called dream sharing, formal processes for soldiers to report and discuss their sleep experiences with unit leaders. These weren't casual conversations, but structured debriefings designed to identify patterns in collective dreaming that might indicate real threats or opportunities. Dream sharing sessions often revealed that multiple soldiers had experienced similar visions or nightmares, providing early warning about enemy movements, weather changes, or other factors that might affect military operations. Roman commanders learned to take these shared dream reports seriously, using them as additional intelligence sources for tactical planning. Some Roman units developed specialized dream interpretation teams, usually composed of soldiers who had demonstrated particular sensitivity to collective, unconscious phenomena. These interpreters would analyze patterns in unit dream reports, looking for actionable intelligence or warnings that might not be apparent through normal reconnaissance methods. The Romans even experimented with what they called directed collective dreaming, techniques for focusing entire units' unconscious minds on specific problems or challenges. Before major battles or complex engineering projects, Roman commanders would use sleep suggestion methods to program their soldiers' dreams to work on tactical solutions while they slept. These directed dreaming experiments produced mixed results. Sometimes units would wake with innovative solutions to military problems that had been puzzling their commanders. Other times, the process would create shared nightmares or anxiety dreams that left entire units psychologically unprepared for combat operations. Roman military medicine included treatments for what they called dream sickness, psychological conditions that developed when soldiers became too deeply involved in collective unconscious phenomena. Some soldiers would lose the ability to distinguish between their own dreams and shared experiences, creating identity confusion and decision-making problems. Treatment for dream sickness involved isolation from unit sleeping arrangements and gradual reintegration into normal collective consciousness networks. Roman military doctors understood that complete isolation from shared dreaming could be as damaging as excessive involvement, so they developed carefully calibrated recovery programs. The Romans also documented how collective consciousness patterns changed based on unit composition and experience levels. Veteran units developed more sophisticated shared awareness networks than groups of new recruits. Mixed units combining veterans and rookies often experienced chaotic collective consciousness that was more disruptive than helpful. Roman military assignments began taking collective consciousness compatibility into account when forming units and planning operations. Soldiers who disrupted shared sleeping patterns or who couldn't integrate into collective awareness networks were often reassigned to roles where their individual sleep habits wouldn't affect unit effectiveness. These compatibility considerations extended to officer assignments as well. Commanders who couldn't participate in or properly manage collective consciousness phenomena were considered unsuitable for leading combat units, regardless of their other military qualifications. Roman military training included specific exercises designed to develop and strengthen collective consciousness abilities. New soldiers would practice synchronized sleeping, shared dreaming techniques, and group awakening responses until they could seamlessly integrate into unit consciousness networks. These training exercises were often more challenging than physical combat preparation because they required soldiers to partially surrender individual identity and merge their unconscious minds with group awareness. Some recruits never successfully mastered these techniques and were assigned to support roles that didn't require collective consciousness participation. But successful collective consciousness training created units that functioned with almost supernatural coordination during both sleeping and waking hours. These elite formations could respond to threats, coordinate movements, and execute complex operations with minimal verbal communication because their shared awareness networks provided constant information exchange. Roman military engineering incorporated collective consciousness principles into camp design and facility construction. Barracks layouts weren't just about space efficiency, but about optimizing the geometric patterns that enhanced shared awareness among sleeping soldiers. Roman architects discovered that certain architectural configurations amplified collective consciousness effects while others dampened or disrupted them. Military construction specifications included detailed requirements for room shapes, ceiling heights, and wall materials that would support, rather than interfere with shared sleeping networks. The Romans even developed portable versions of consciousness, enhancing architecture for temporary camps and field operations. These collapsible structures could be quickly assembled to create optimal conditions for collective awareness, allowing units to maintain their shared sleeping networks even during rapid deployment operations. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Roman collective consciousness research was their discovery of what they called distance sharing, the ability for separated units to maintain awareness connections across significant geographic distances, Roman military records include accounts of units that continued to share dreams and awakening responses even when stationed hundreds of miles apart. These distance-sharing phenomena were particularly valuable for coordinating operations across extended frontiers, where normal communication methods were slow or unreliable. Roman commanders could sometimes sense the status of distant units through shared consciousness networks, receiving early warning about attacks or other developments through dream connections. However, distance sharing was unpredictable and couldn't be relied upon for critical military communications. Roman military doctrine treated these phenomena as supplementary intelligence sources rather than primary communication methods, but commanders learned to pay attention to persistent shared experiences that might indicate real developments in distant theatres. Roman military culture also created social hierarchies based on collective consciousness abilities. Soldiers who demonstrated exceptional sensitivity to shared awareness networks gained respect and influence that extended beyond normal military ranks. These individuals often became informal leaders whose opinions carried weight even when they held junior official positions. Conversely, soldiers who couldn't participate in collective consciousness or who disrupted shared sleeping networks faced social isolation and limited advancement opportunities. Roman military society valued group harmony and shared awareness as much as individual combat skills or tactical knowledge. These social pressures created complex dynamics within Roman units where soldiers had to balance individual identity with group consciousness participation. Some individuals struggled with the psychological demands of shared awareness, feeling that they were losing their personal identity in the collective unconscious network. Roman military medicine developed treatments for what they called consciousness fragmentation, psychological conditions where soldiers became trapped between individual and collective awareness states. These conditions could manifest as persistent confusion about personal identity, inability to make independent decisions, or compulsive need to maintain constant contact with sleeping comrades. Treatment involved carefully managed reintegration therapy that helped soldiers establish healthy boundaries between individual consciousness and group awareness participation. Roman military doctors understood that both complete isolation and total submersion in collective consciousness could create psychological problems. The Romans also studied how collective consciousness patterns were affected by combat stress and traumatic experiences. Units that had survived major battles often developed altered shared awareness, characteristics that could persist for months or years after the traumatic events. These post-trauma collective consciousness changes sometimes created enhanced unit cohesion and effectiveness, as soldiers who had shared extreme experiences developed deeper awareness connections. But trauma could also fragment collective consciousness networks, creating units where shared sleeping became impossible and group coordination suffered. Roman military medical protocols included specific procedures for rebuilding collective consciousness networks in units that had been psychologically damaged by combat experiences. These reconstruction programs involved graduated group sleeping exercises, shared storytelling sessions, and ritual activities designed to restore trust and emotional connection among unit members. Recovery of collective consciousness after trauma was considered as important as physical healing and tactical retraining for returning units to effective service. Roman commanders understood that units with damaged shared awareness networks were vulnerable to surprise attacks and coordination failures regardless of their individual soldier capabilities. Roman military retirement and veteran support systems included provisions for former soldiers who had difficulty adjusting to civilian sleep patterns after years of collective consciousness participation. These veterans often experienced persistent insomnia and anxiety when sleeping alone, having become psychologically dependent on shared awareness networks. Veteran support programs included group housing arrangements where former soldiers could continue sharing sleeping spaces and maintaining modified versions of military collective consciousness networks. These civilian adaptations helped ease the transition from military to civilian life, while preserving beneficial aspects of shared awareness. Some Roman veterans never successfully adjusted to individual sleeping patterns and formed permanent communities where military-style collective consciousness practices continued throughout their civilian lives. These veteran settlements often became centres of military expertise and training that supported the broader Roman military system. The influence of Roman collective consciousness culture extended into civilian religious and philosophical practices as well. Roman temples and mystery cults adopted modified versions of shared sleeping techniques for spiritual purposes, creating civilian applications of military consciousness research. Roman philosophical schools studied collective consciousness phenomena as examples of the interconnectedness of human minds and the possibility of transcending individual limitations through group awareness. These academic investigations helped legitimize and preserve military sleep research even as the empire's military power declined. But the legacy of Roman collective consciousness research also included warnings about the dangers of losing individual identity in group awareness networks. Roman writers documented cases where entire units became so merged in collective consciousness that individual soldiers lost the ability to function independently, creating military formations that were effective only as unified groups. These extreme collective consciousness cases provided cautionary examples that influenced later military organizations' approaches to unit cohesion and shared awareness training. The Roman experience demonstrated both the potential benefits and serious risks of pushing group consciousness techniques beyond natural limits. Roman military sleep culture ultimately revealed that the boundary between individual and collective awareness is far more flexible than most people realize. Their experiments in shared consciousness created military advantages that contributed to Roman imperial success, but also demonstrated the psychological costs of transcending normal human limitations. The Romans proved that human consciousness could be systematically modified and enhanced through disciplined training and environmental manipulation. But they also discovered that these modifications created dependencies and vulnerabilities that could persist long after the original military purposes had ended. Today, Roman collective consciousness research provides insights into group psychology, team coordination, and the potential for enhanced human performance through shared awareness techniques. But it also serves as a reminder that pushing the boundaries of human consciousness creates responsibilities for managing the long-term consequences of such modifications. And in the quiet hours before dawn, when the night is deepest and individual, consciousness blurs into something larger and more mysterious. The echoes of Roman collective awareness still whisper across the centuries, reminding us that the human mind contains possibilities we are only beginning to understand. The sleeping legions may have marched into history, but their dreams of shared consciousness continue to influence our understanding of what it means to be both individual and collective, separate and connected, awake and asleep in a world where the boundaries between self and others remain far more permeable than we dare to imagine. In those final moments before sleep takes hold, when consciousness begins to dissolve and the day's vigilance finally relaxes, we might sometimes sense what the Romans discovered in their frost-covered camps and moonlit battlefields. That sleep itself is not solitary but shared, not individual but collective, not an ending but a beginning of awareness that extends far beyond the boundaries of any single dreaming mind. The Romans discovered that sleep itself could be weaponized in ways that went far beyond simple exhaustion tactics. They developed what military historians now call sleep warfare, psychological operations specifically designed to exploit their enemies' rest patterns and transform sleep from a necessity into a vulnerability. Roman intelligence networks spent considerable resources mapping the sleep schedules of opposing armies. They would infiltrate enemy camps disguised as merchants or deserters, carefully observing when guards changed shifts, when commanders retired to their quarters, and most importantly, when entire units entered their deepest sleep phases. But the Romans didn't just gather this information for planning surprise attacks. They used it to create what they called perpetual vigilance campaigns, sustained psychological pressure designed to prevent enemy forces from achieving restorative rest over extended periods. Roman engineers developed specialized equipment for sleep disruption operations. They created devices that could produce specific types of sounds at precise volumes, loud enough to prevent deep sleep but quiet enough to avoid triggering full alertness responses. These acoustic weapons could maintain enemy forces in a state of chronic partial awakening that gradually degraded their military effectiveness without provoking immediate retaliation. The most sophisticated Roman sleep warfare involved manipulation of natural environmental factors that affected rest quality. Roman forces would contaminate enemy water supplies with mild stimulants that prevented deep sleep without causing obvious illness. They would introduce insects and parasites into enemy camps that would create persistent discomfort during rest periods. Roman psychological warfare specialists understood that different types of sleep disruption created different military vulnerabilities. Preventing REM sleep through frequent awakening created decision-making impairments in enemy commanders. Disrupting deep sleep phases reduced physical strength and endurance in enemy soldiers. Fragmenting sleep patterns destroyed unit coordination and communication effectiveness. These sleep warfare techniques were particularly effective during siege operations, where enemy forces were confined to limited areas and couldn't easily relocate to escape Roman sleep disruption efforts. Roman siege engineers would position their camps to maximize noise pollution, affecting besieged defenders, while carefully managing their own forces' rest requirements. Roman catapult crews developed specialized ammunition designed specifically for sleep disruption rather than structural damage. They would launch hollow projectiles filled with materials that created specific sounds when they landed, timing these launches to coincide with enemy sleep periods and prevent sustained rest. But Roman sleep warfare extended beyond tactical battlefield applications. They used long-term sleep disruption strategies against entire populations in rebellious provinces, creating widespread fatigue that reduced civilian support for anti-Roman resistance movements. Roman administrators would implement regulations that disrupted traditional sleep patterns in occupied territories. They would schedule mandatory civic activities during normal rest hours, require participation in Roman religious ceremonies that conflicted with local sleep customs, and impose work schedules that prevented communities from maintaining their ancestral rest traditions. These civilian sleep warfare campaigns were designed to create psychological dependency on Roman administrative systems. Populations that couldn't maintain traditional rest patterns without Roman permission became more compliant and less likely to support independence movements or rebellion attempts. Roman military theorists documented how sleep warfare could be used to accelerate the integration of conquered territories into the empire. Communities that adopted Roman sleep schedules and rest practices developed closer identification with Roman culture and were more likely to produce loyal soldiers and administrators for imperial service. But sleep warfare also created unexpected vulnerabilities for Roman forces themselves. Enemy commanders who understood Roman sleep discipline could exploit their predictable rest patterns and rigid guard rotation schedules. Some barbarian leaders learned to time their attacks specifically to exploit known vulnerabilities in Roman sleep management systems. Roman military doctrine evolved to address these counter-sleep warfare threats. They developed irregular sleep schedules that were harder for enemies to predict, created false sleep patterns to deceive enemy intelligence, and implemented deception operations designed to make Roman rest arrangements appear different. from their actual practices. Roman forces also learned to use their own sleep discipline as bait for enemy attacks. They would create apparent vulnerabilities in their rest arrangements, encouraging enemy forces to attack during what seemed like optimal moments, only to reveal that the apparent sleeping soldiers were actually fully alert and prepared for combat. These false vulnerability tactics required extraordinary discipline from Roman soldiers who had to appear genuinely asleep while maintaining combat readiness. Some Roman units developed the ability to maintain defensive formations while giving every appearance of being unconscious and unprepared. Roman military engineers designed camp layouts that supported these deceptive sleep arrangements. They created hidden observation posts where alert soldiers could monitor apparently sleeping comrades, underground passages that allowed rapid reinforcement of seemingly vulnerable areas, and camouflaged defensive positions that appeared to be unguarded rest areas. The Romans also developed counterintelligence techniques specifically designed to protect their sleep warfare operations from enemy detection. They created false intelligence about their own rest patterns, fed misleading information to suspected enemy spies, and implemented security protocols that prevented unauthorized observation of genuine Roman sleep practices. Roman sleep warfare specialists became among the most secretive and protected personnel in the imperial military system. Their knowledge of sleep manipulation techniques was considered so valuable that they were assigned permanent bodyguards and were never allowed to serve in units that might be captured by enemy forces. These sleep warfare experts developed training programs that were passed down through carefully controlled apprenticeship networks. The techniques were never written down in detail, but were transmitted orally through generations of specialists who refined and improved the methods based on operational experience. Roman military medicine included specialized treatments for soldiers who had been subjected to enemy sleep warfare attacks. Military doctors developed techniques for restoring normal rest patterns after prolonged sleep disruption, treating the psychological trauma associated with chronic sleep deprivation, and rebuilding unit cohesion after sleep warfare campaigns. Recovery from enemy sleep warfare often required extended rehabilitation periods, where affected soldiers were gradually reintroduced to normal military duties. Roman medical facilities included specialized wards designed to provide optimal conditions for sleep recovery, with features that promoted deep rest and psychological healing. Roman military culture also developed rituals and ceremonies designed to cleanse soldiers who had been contaminated by enemy sleep manipulation. These purification rites were believed to remove spiritual pollution associated with unnatural sleep experiences and restore soldiers' connection to proper Roman rest traditions. The Romans understood that sleep warfare created moral and ethical challenges that went beyond normal military considerations. Deliberate manipulation of sleep patterns was seen as a violation of natural order that could have spiritual consequences for both attackers and victims. Roman military priests developed special prayers and offerings designed to protect Roman forces from the spiritual dangers associated with sleep warfare operations. These religious protections were considered as important as physical equipment and tactical training for soldiers engaged in sleep manipulation campaigns. But the most disturbing aspect of Roman sleep warfare was their discovery that sleep manipulation techniques could create permanent changes in enemy populations. Communities subjected to prolonged sleep disruption sometimes never fully recovered their original rest patterns, creating lasting psychological damage that persisted for generations. Roman military records document cases where entire tribes or city-states continued to experience sleep disorders decades after Roman sleep warfare campaigns had ended. These populations often showed reduced fertility, increased mental illness, and cultural breakdown that made them permanently dependent on Roman administrative support. The long-term consequences of sleep warfare raised questions about the ethics and sustainability of these techniques that troubled some Roman military leaders. Critics argued that sleep manipulation created more problems than it solved, and that the psychological damage extended far beyond legitimate military targets. Roman military doctrine eventually placed restrictions on sleep warfare operations, limiting their use to specific tactical situations and requiring approval from senior commanders who could evaluate the broader strategic implications. These limitations reflected growing understanding of the far-reaching consequences of sleep manipulation. However, Roman sleep warfare techniques continued to influence military thinking throughout the imperial period and beyond. The fundamental insight that sleep could be systematically exploited as a military vulnerability became embedded in Roman strategic culture and was passed down to successor military organizations. Medieval warfare incorporated many Roman sleep manipulation concepts, adapting them for different technological and social conditions. The basic principles of using rest patterns as tactical intelligence and exploiting sleep vulnerabilities for military advantage remained relevant across changing historical contexts. Modern military sleep research continues to build on foundations established by Roman sleep warfare specialists, though contemporary approaches place greater emphasis on protecting friendly forces rather than disrupting enemy rest patterns. The ethical concerns raised by Roman experiences with sleep manipulation continue to influence current military, medical, and operational doctrine. The Roman legacy in sleep warfare demonstrates both the potential effectiveness and serious dangers of treating human rest requirements as strategic resources that can be manipulated for military advantage. Their experiences provide valuable lessons about the limits and consequences of pushing sleep-related tactics beyond humanitarian boundaries. And in the darkest chapters of Roman military history, where sleep itself became a weapon turned against human vulnerability, we find reminders that some victories come at costs too high to justify, creating wounds that outlast empires and echo through generations of troubled dreams that never quite find peace. The Romans proved that sleep could be conquered, manipulated, and weaponized, but they also discovered that some conquests extract prices that continue compounding long after the original battles have been forgotten, leaving behind populations whose rest was forever altered by the ambitions of an empire that sought to control even dreams themselves. In those quiet moments before dawn, when the world hangs suspended between night and day, we might remember the Roman soldiers who learned that sleep was not just rest but territory to be conquered. Not just personal necessity, but strategic resource to be exploited, leaving behind a legacy written in the language of interrupted dreams and rest that never came easily to those who dared to weaponize the most fundamental human vulnerabilities. Their sleep warfare techniques vanished with the legions, but the questions they raised about the ethics of exploiting human biological necessities continue to challenge military organizations that must balance effectiveness with humanity, victory with conscience, and the demands of survival with the preservation of what makes survival worthwhile. So there we have it, Night Wanderers, the strange, exhausting, and utterly bizarre world of Roman military sleep habits, from soldiers sleeping in full armour to the haunting phenomenon of somnus mortis, from collective consciousness networks that defied explanation to sleep warfare that weaponized rest itself. The Romans transformed the most basic human need into something far more complex and strategic than we ever imagined. These weren't just military procedures or tactical innovations, they were adaptations that pushed human limits in ways that left permanent marks on everyone who experienced them. The Romans proved that sleep could be conquered, disciplined, and even weaponized, but they also discovered that every boundary crossed came with costs that echoed through generations. Tonight, as you settle into your comfortable bed, far from frozen Germanic frontiers and the constant threat of barbarian raids, perhaps you'll spare a thought for those Roman soldiers who learned to rest with one eye open, one hand on their weapons, and part of their minds always listening for danger in the dark. They conquered the world partly by conquering sleep itself, leaving behind a legacy written in disciplined exhaustion and dreams that carried the weight of empire, even in unconsciousness, sweet dreams. And remember, sometimes the most boring history makes for the most peaceful sleep.